Recording. Hello and welcome back. This is Roger Royce, host of the 10,000 Startups podcast, where every week we bring you very topical, relevant information on legal issues of interest to startup companies. Now, today we're going to talk about the CTA, which we've done podcasts on this before, and I've been planning on doing one at the end of 2024. But every day for the last couple of weeks, it seems the law's been changing, or there's been a new development, or something that's different. So I've been kind of waiting to see it shake out. And here we are on January 2nd. I'm not sure. They certainly haven't settled yet. And I don't think if they're going to anytime soon, but nevertheless, we want to give you an update as to where things are because, some of you probably maybe should have filed by now. I don't know. We're going to find out. Our guest here today is Lawson. She's an attorney with Haynes Boone in Denver, Colorado. Lucky you. She advises corporations, partnerships, LLCs, and tax exempts on business planning and tax issues, as well as the federal and state aspects of mergers and acquisitions. It's interesting. You find a lot of tax lawyers, especially tax controversy lawyers, that are getting involved in this space. And maybe it's because of these, humongous penalties that potentially could apply. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. But in the meantime, thanks for being here, Annie, to kind of bring us up to date on what's going on with the Corporate Transparency Act. So to get things started, just to kind of level set, could you maybe just tell us what is the Corporate Transparency Act and why and who should care?
Of course. Thanks, Roger, and Happy New Year. Good to be starting the year off with such a dramatic topic right now. I think the Corporate Transparency Act, it's good that it's becoming a hot topic because it really should be front of mind for every person who owns a piece in a company in the United States or is an officer or other person in a managerial role in a company in the United States. So that probably applies to everyone watching this podcast or listening in. And this act, the CTA, was a piece of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. The act as a whole, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, was enacted over a presidential veto. So this was a piece of legislation that had bipartisan support and was pushed through over a veto in 2020. And it is designed to be implemented and enforced by the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network. FinCEN is how I'll refer to that government agency. FinCEN is a body of the Department of Treasury, which is why me as a tax lawyer, it felt relevant to my practice, a part of the Department of Treasury, kind of a branch similar to the IRS. So I have dove in deep into the CTA, which has proven to be a fun and recently exciting exercise. And what the CTA does is it establishes reporting obligations that require reporting companies, which is a term of art under the statute, to file a report with FinCEN that identifies its beneficial owners and company applicants. This legislation is designed to primarily apply to smaller private entities, not large companies or otherwise highly regulated companies. So within the statute, there are 23 exemptions for companies like large operating companies. Those are companies that have a physical presence in the United States, have more than 20 employees, and have filed a federal tax return in the last year showing 5 million or more in gross receipts. There are other exemptions for banks, securities issuers, generally entities that file reporting statements with the SEC can be exempt. So again, this is designed to apply to privately held companies, so startups, family businesses, anyone who doesn't meet that large operating company threshold or isn't otherwise filing reports with the government are almost definitely going to be falling under the Corporate Transparency Act and needing to file these beneficial ownership reports.
Yeah, that's most of my clients. Most startups are in this bucket. I mean, I know there's an exemption for some VCs, there's an exemption for bigger
Yes.
companies that have a certain revenue threshold, but almost all of my clients had to file these. So up until recently, when were these to be filed? What was the filing deadline? And I got to believe everybody, has been inundated with a couple years worth of emails saying, here's a deadline, make sure you get this filed. So we probably already know, but I get them confused because there's so many different deadlines. Can you summarize?
Yes. For companies that were in existence prior to 2024, the deadline was yesterday, January 1st, 2025. So they had all of 2024 to collect the information and get their report into Fenson. Now, like you said, that's before all of this litigation threw everything up in the air. For companies that were formed in 2024, they were subject to a 90-day deadline for their initial report and subject to a 30-day deadline for updates to that report due to changes in the reported information. Companies formed going forward, so 2025 and on, will have 30 days for both their initial report and that updated report for changes to the beneficial ownership information.
Yeah, and just briefly, so what happens if you don't? Can you say to the government, "Oh, I forgot," or "I just didn't want to"? Up before the recent litigation. You,
Yes, those are actually two very different things. I forgot versus I didn't want to under the statute. Um, I guess, or I didn't know versus I didn't want to. So the statute penalizes um, willful actions. So if you willfully file an incorrect report or willfully fail to file a report, you're subject to some pretty substantial penalties. For this year, the civil penalties are $591 per day the violation continues. And
continue. That's important. It's
right,
uncapped, as I understand it. So
it's
it could be a
uncapped,
big number.
entirely uncapped. And that is the civil penalty. There's also a criminal penalty of a fine up to $10,000 and possible imprisonment up to 2 years for an individual. And that's interesting because it's notable that the individuals who would be responsible for filing these reports actually are subject to these penalties. So it's not just that the company will have to pay the civil fine. The officer or manager who would be responsible for filing this, if they willfully fail to file or file incorrect information, could actually be individually responsible for criminal penalty and potentially jail time.
That is just what's so shocking about this. A criminal penalty for, and I'll tell you, it is in some ways it's a simple filing if you have a simple company with simple
Yeah.
facts, but it gets very fuzzy and ambiguous very quickly. I've been finding. And I'm on a listserv with the business law section of the American Bar, and somebody this morning posted an email
Mm-hmm.
that said, well, those criminal penalties are probably only reserved for people that the government wants to get, and they can't get them on anything else. For example, Al Capone went to prison for tax evasion,
Right.
right? Not for murder, not for racketeering, not for any of that other stuff,
Yeah.
tax evasion. And it probably wouldn't have if he hadn't been Al Capone. And this might be that kind of case, but it's still pretty
Yeah.
scary whenever you hear criminal penalties for not filing a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's kind of bring us up to what's happened recently. So tell me about the litigation. And then I'm going to ask you some super difficult practical questions as to what we're supposed to do with that later.
Yeah.
But maybe you can summarize what's happened the last few weeks.
For some background, there have been multiple cases filed alleging that the CTA is unconstitutional. There's been cases in Oregon, Alabama, and there have been differing outcomes in those cases. Um, Three district courts have ruled that the CTA is constitutional. Those cases have been appealed. The Alabama case went the other way. That district court judge ruled that the CTA is unconstitutional. But that judge issued an injunction against the enforcement of the CTA only against the plaintiffs in that case. So the people who actually brought the suit did not have to comply with the CTA in the Alabama case. Now, what's different about Texas Top Shop, which is the most recent case, is that the district court ruled that the CTA is unconstitutional and issued a nationwide injunction. That means that FinCEN is prohibited from enforcing the CTA against anyone, not just the plaintiffs in that case.
Yeah, to pause on that for a second, think about that. That's the first odd thing. You've got a district court, federal district court in Texas, because the other cases, I think the rulings just applied to the litigants that were before the court. But in this case in Texas, it's nationwide, a nationwide injunction, which is sort of a surprise. I would guess somebody must have appealed that.
Yes. And it's interesting because these nationwide injunctions happen, and they're very controversial and often, and they've kind of evaded Supreme Court review because often by the time the Supreme Court would review the issue at hand, the fact that it's subject to a nationwide injunction is actually moot because the court is going to rule on the constitutionality of that statute. So whether or not the nationwide injunction was appropriate is no longer relevant to the court's decision-making process. So it really is presenting this kind of fun constitutional issue, if you're a law nerd, less relevant to people who just want to know what they have to file. But so December 3rd, the district court issued that nationwide injunction. 3 days later, the Department of Justice filed an appeal with the Fifth Circuit and requested a stay of the injunction. So injunction keeps FinCEN from enforcing the CTA. A stay of the injunction would pause that injunction and allow FinCEN to enforce the Corporate Transparency Act. On December 23rd, a motions panel of the Fifth Circuit granted that motion for stay. So on December 23rd, the CTA was again enforceable. FinCEN responded by extending the filing deadline by about 2 weeks, the number of days that the injunction had been in effect. So the deadline was mid-January. Just 3 days later, December 26th, day after Christmas, we got another fun surprise. The merits panel of the Fifth Circuit, so the panel that will actually hear the merits of the appeal, vacated the stay, therefore making the injunction effective, again, preventing FinCEN from enforcing the CTA. So as it stands right now, filings are not required. However, yesterday, the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General of the United States, filed an emergency motion, a petition in the Supreme Court, requesting that they stay the district court injunction again, therefore allowing FinCEN to enforce the CTA during the pendency of the appeal with the Fifth Circuit and potentially Supreme Court.
Okay, and so we're waiting to hear what the Supreme Court does with that, if anything, right?
Yes. So Justice Alito is the justice that hears emergency motions for the Fifth Circuit, and he can choose to rule on it immediately or request a response from the other side. So request a response from the plaintiffs in this case. Likely he'll request a response from the plaintiffs in this case, and we'll see what happens from there.
I see. Wow. So, all right. Now getting back to the practical aspects of this, the legal drama is certainly interesting.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about what's going on in the background. I mean, it's not like this came up by surprise. We've had years that we knew this was happening, and all of a sudden we get all this court action right at the very last minute. But suppose you're a company now. You're a startup company, and you were supposed to file by January 1. Then you heard that you didn't have to, so you didn't. Then you heard that you had to by mid-January, and now you hear that you don't have to again. I mean, what is a company to do at this point?
I think companies should be prepared to file. Have your information ready. Hopefully you had already begun the process of considering who your beneficial owners are. And after that, it's really about, okay, I have to report their address, their date of birth, a copy of their driver's license or passport, right? So gather that information, have it ready to go. Filings right now are voluntary. So if you don't have an issue with filing these reports and you just want to get it off your plate, you certainly can. FinCEN is still accepting reports. The website is functional. So if you'd like to check it off your list, you can. If you want to wait and see how the litigation plays out, I would just have it ready to go. Like you said, for most companies, this isn't going to be that big of a lift, but you don't want to hear that the injunction has been stayed and FinCEN is now this time not offering any sort of additional extension of the filing deadline, and all of a sudden you're non-compliant, right? That if FinCEN didn't grant a discretionary extension of the deadline and the court stays the injunction, filings would be due that day. And I don't think everyone will be on top of their game enough to file on that day, but if they did, the website's going to crash.
Yeah,
Practically the website's not going to function if 30 million companies try to file the day the injunction is lifted. And I think that companies should have their information in hand, just be ready to put that information in just in case we have a 2-week deadline like we did just a few days ago.
Okay, that's good advice. The voluntary filing part, I think, is the important part. I mean, my advice is just file it, and then you don't have to worry about it, and you don't have to jump up and read the papers every morning to see what the court's
Agree.
Now you said
for
something
small
kind of
companies,
yeah,
especially for small companies, you're already, this information is going to the Department of Treasury. It's honestly the same information that's on your tax return. So it's not like you're allowing the government to, read your personal journal. It's not
well,
that invasive of information for most people.
that's a good point. I mean, this is only for law enforcement. However,
Mm-hmm.
we just had a recent state-sponsored hack of a federal government website.
Yeah,
So, nothing is 100% secure, and people just have to know that.
very
Now,
true.
something kind of interesting right at the start that actually, if I knew it, I'd forgotten. But you said this bill was passed over a presidential veto.
Yes,
Was that Trump? Did Trump veto it?
yes, yes.
Okay. Well, for those of you that are political buffs like me, you probably know that Trump was reelected president, and he's going to be in office in a couple of weeks. That might change everything legislatively, don't you think?
It could change everything procedurally if when Trump appoints a new solicitor general. Will they choose to follow up with these appeals? Will they choose to continue the appeal, or will the CTA, die with the district court ruled unconstitutional? Now, this is slightly above my pay grade. I'm not a Supreme Court attorney. We'll have to speak with someone else about that, but it'll be really interesting to see as the administration changes over, as officials within the Department of Justice change over, how procedurally this plays out.
Okay, well, we live in interesting times in this space, it sounds like. So we'll just have to keep an eye on it for now, mostly out of intellectual interest, if nothing else.
Yes.
Any other advice for companies going forward into 2025 that we haven't covered?
Hold tight.
Hold tight. Okay.
I think, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, set to expire. I mean, there's a lot of interesting tax provisions at play here, and it's going to be really interesting to see how legislation moves forward for the next 4 years. So
Yeah,
lots,
we'll definitely
lots to
cover that. TCTA expiration, but that's another one. Just like CTA, we don't know if it's really going to expire anymore.
right, exactly.
With the election.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Okay, well, I want to thank you for being here, Annie. This just really kind of sums it up in a nutshell. because it's, it's confusing and hard to keep straight. So many things have happened over the past couple of weeks. So I'm glad you're on top of it. And if people want to get a hold of you, I assume you're not hiding. You could be found on the website or at annie.lawson@haynesboone.com, right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, thanks very much. This is Roger Royce with Haynes Boone. This is the 10,000 Startups podcast that you've been listening to. See you all next week.
Thanks, Roger.